This week's topic is traditional law in the Celtic lands. And I'm going to talk not just about a legal system or legal systems. I'm going to talk more broadly about the structure of society, how the traditional Celtic societies functioned, what their architecture was, if you will. And from out of that, from the sort of broader sense of how the societies were built and how they function, narrow the focus to talk about how order was maintained, sort of how the social fabric was maintained generation to generation. And along the way, there'll be some thoughts about what that has to do with the work of the Druids we talked about the last 2 weeks. So to start, I'll start with that point, which is to reiterate Julius Caesar's extended description of the Druids as jurists, as arbiters of law, those who decided on penalties in the case of legal disputes or crime, that they were expected to render just verdicts, just decisions based on precedent. They were, in a certain sense, arbitrators within the society, in addition to priests. I think it's easy to think of the Druids primarily as priests of the Celts, as the pagan priesthood of the pre-Christian Celtic peoples, but it's a far more sophisticated and complex role than that. They were, as I think I said the first week, the repositories of the whole of the culture, in a sense, that each of them, or at least those who had reached the level of Druid per se, were expected to be able to carry in themselves all of the traditions, the important features of their societies and the culture in which they lived, and to act as a sort of glue within that society, to be able to use the phrase I used a moment ago, hold order, maintain the order of the society. So we'll talk a little bit about what that order was like, and just what sorts of laws the Druids and other functionaries of the Druid classes would have enforced, what sorts of judgments they would have reached and rendered, and the penalties they would have enforced. First thing that's important to note is that traditional Celtic culture is based primarily on kinship rather than on an overarching national identity. You have to get sort of relatively recent in history to start to get notions of, say, Ireland as a nation. For much of its history, Ireland was divided at the very least into North and South, and there was always a sort of polarization, kind of a struggle between the North and the South. Even in the periods in Irish history where there was a high king, so-called, who would, in theory, rule over all the Gaelic-speaking peoples, all the peoples of Ireland, there was often a sort of a contention as to where that high king would be seated or where he would come from the north half or the south half. And there are some subtle and some not so subtle cultural differences between the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland. And I don't just mean, in the contemporary sense of, the troubles with the British occupied north and then the rest of the Republic. This is, deeper in history. They're pre-Christian and Christian era. And one of the, I think one of the most important hallmarks of that is that it appears, at least from the evidence that I've seen, that Christianity, for example, established itself first probably in the south of Ireland. We're accustomed to thinking of St. Patrick as having evangelized and converted the Irish people to Christianity, and his most important centers, those places most closely associated with him, are primarily in the north, particularly Armagh. But there probably was Christianity, small Christian communities, or at least families who practiced Christianity, well established in the south prior to Patrick's coming. And there is a distinction, and this is just one example of difference between north and south. There is a distinction to some degree, at least early on, in the sort of flavor of the way the church, Christian church, was organized and operated within Ireland between North and South. The North, following Patrick's lead, was a center for the Roman enforced hierarchy. Their practice, their organization, the ecclesiastical organization of the church centered in the North, looked very much to Rome and proceeded very much according to the Roman model. And that, for one thing, meant that as time passed and population centers developed in Ireland, which is a point I'm going to come back to, I think, shortly, the structure of the church within Ireland became increasingly allied with and paralleled the government of those population centers. In the South, you had something that a lot of people, I think, see as the more traditional, quote-unquote, Celtic Christian model, which is religious institutions that were centered more on families, or to use the familiar Scottish term, on clans. And we'll talk much more about that in a second. That you had more isolated, more monastic Christianity, perhaps, initially in the south of Ireland. That's all a huge generalization. It's probably an oversimplification, but I think there's something to it in terms of a broad strokes differentiation of the Northern Irish culture and Southern Irish culture, at least as far as Christianity goes and Christian institutions went. And there are other examples. Some of the mythology and the folklore is different. Some of the important figures in the mythology and the folklore in the South are different than in the North. There were competing centers of kingship. Cashel, which is pretty famous as a Christian monastic site and Christian ecclesiastic site from the Middle Ages, was a center of kingship in the southern half of Ireland. So all of that is really just a kind of a roundabout way to illustrate that even as we get well into the historic era, and even as we start to think about Ireland as an island where there was a high king, where hypothetically, theoretically, the Irish were all ruled by this one person, the reality on the ground was different. That the island was really divided into not just north and south, but into provinces, and really, most importantly, into kinship groups, which I'm going to talk more about in more detail right now. Nations, as such, tend to be defined by outsiders, by those who aren't part of the nation or who speak a different language, whose customs are radically different. And that's a sort of an outside-in definition of a culture or an ethnic grouping, or in this case we'll just use the word nation. The most important structure within the traditional Celtic cultures, and I'm going to probably focus more on Ireland than any of the other Celtic nations this evening, the most important structure was a localized kin group that had different kinds of relationships, various relationships with other kin groups that sometimes operated in common cause with them, in concert with the other regional kin groups, sometimes intermarried, et cetera, all the sort of fairly commonplace interactions you can imagine between sort of local tribes. In Ireland, the word for the kind of largest local grouping was the Tuath, T-U-A-T-H, Tuath. This could be thought of as a small regional, we could call it a chiefdom. The ruler, the head of this grouping would have been a Ri, R-I, which is a word for king. It's related to the Latin rex, for example. But it really sort of means a chieftain, effectively. The word itself may suggest and literally mean king, but in terms of the scale of what this person had influence over, it was really more of a chieftain. Now, at different times in Irish history, there were other kings over these regional kings. There is the Ruireach, R-U-I-R-E-A-C-H, which you could define as over-king. And Beyond that, there was the Rírurik, or also referred to as the Rícoichead, which is Coiced, which is a word for province. So that was a provincial king, and that would roughly be somebody who ruled over approximately a quarter of the island of Ireland, to give you some sense of scale. The Tua may have originally been structured around something like 3,000 men. That's a kind of an interesting number. The Indo-European cultures, as I've mentioned previously, have a thing for the number 3. So it wouldn't be surprising if that was actually a legitimate number. There's some parallels to this, I think, in the Roman military. They had units of 3,000 men. So that's entirely possible that that's true. In a Tua, and this is something I'll come back to in the last lecture in this series, you would have perhaps a regional fair that would take place every so often, where people from their isolated farmsteads and sort of clan holds, if you will, would come together to transact agricultural business and other business, marriages, disputes at law, and so forth. Within the Tua, which you could think of as perhaps a tribe, a very extended collection of people, you had a smaller unit of people who had much closer blood relationship that in Ireland was known as the Derbfine, and that's Derbfine. And that's a little closer to, say, what you would think of in popular the popular mind as being the clan, the Scottish clan. That was an extended kin group, an extended family unit that consisted of people who shared a common great-grandfather. So that's how many generations you went back. And it's that unit, the Derbfine, that really is the driving engine of the law system that I'm going to come back to and talk about in a bit. Without that having a real recognizable, real concrete importance, the law codes as we find them in traditional Celtic cultures couldn't have functioned. I'll explain why in a little bit. Land was held in common within these kin groups. Not probably terribly surprising, since in the sort of classic period, particularly pre-Christian Celtic history, the Celts were primarily pastoralists. They relied heavily on stock herding, and so you would put out your stock to graze in common pasturage, and people would go out into the pasture lands and tend to the herds and the flocks during the warm half of the year, and then everybody, including the stock, would come back in during the so-called dark half of the year. I'm fond of likening this to, sort of communist or even Marxist system. That's probably, again, a vast oversimplification and maybe doesn't really do it justice. But just as a way of kind of provoking thought and setting off the traditional systems against what we're familiar with in North America, in the 21st century, I think it's kind of worth putting that out there and thinking about it. It's not the same. They didn't have the same sense of personal property and private ownership, particularly of land, that we do, especially in North America these days. I think even in England, which is not a Celtic nation per se, but which still, I think, hews a little more closely to some of the traditional values of the British Islands, and some of the earlier values found in those islands. You're much more likely to have sort of less rigid boundaries around land. There's much more of a tradition of people being able to go for hikes across private property without having to jump over some sort of razor wire or electrified fence. There's much more of a real sense that the land, even if it's deeded to one owner, and even if that owner is raising crops or grazing stock on that land, that there's still something important about allowing people right of passage, right to pass over that land. That sense of setting up perimeter around your property became, really a bone of contention in the United States, or parts of North America that were to later become the United States, particularly in the 19th century. And there's, books and even movies about some of the conflict between people who wanted to close off their land versus those who felt that it all should be free range. And in America, we've tended to come down on the side of closing off property, of letting people deny access to their property. That once you purchase the land or some part of the land, it's yours to do with as you please in some way. And that's not really the value system you would have found in traditional Celtic society. As an aside, and I use this example a lot, I don't know that it really means anything, but in the Irish language there's no verb to have. There is only prepositional phrases that imply position, proximity. To say I have a book, you said "Tá leabhar agam," which means there is a book at me. They didn't have the verb to have. You could say my book, mo leabhar, but you can't say you have it. I said a few moments ago that between family groupings there were the sort of expected transactions and interactions that could include things like marriage. These were not just sort of horizontal between sort of groups of equals, but also happened between individuals and sort of more individuals and other individuals of higher status within the culture, and also horizontally between individuals of similar stature, similar status in the society. And these transactions, the most familiar of which would be marriage, but maybe even more important and perhaps far more alien to contemporary sensibilities, was fosterage, was the fostering of children from one family group into another, particularly from one family into a household of higher status. And there were transactions of property, the passing along of property as part of that transaction to enable a child to move from one group into another and be maintained as part of this other family, this other household, if you will. These were actually critical. They were ubiquitous. You found them in pretty much all of the traditional Celtic societies. And that institution of fostering is another really sort of central and yet, for us, fairly unfamiliar hallmark, central and unfamiliar feature, I should say, of traditional Celtic culture as opposed to the culture that we live in. When you were fostered, your fostering family considered you to be part of the family. Relationships between foster siblings were important and were for life. There were specific words that were honorifics that referred to the male head of the household into which you were fostered, that essentially implied teacher. You were fostered with the expectation that you were going to, in a certain sense, be improved by that transaction. All of this is part of a broader picture that I'm going to speak about in a little bit more detail in a second here, of a real respect for interconnectedness within society. Interconnectedness of individual to individual and kin group to kin group. And that as part of and part and parcel of this interconnectedness, there are responsibilities that grow out of that. And we'll start to talk at this point about some of what that is. The law codes that I'm going to start to talk about in a little bit more detail now are all built upon the assumption of interconnectedness within the society and, more importantly, of shared responsibility. That if you are connected by some sort of recognizable, customarily recognized relationship with some other person or with some other group of people, that there were predictable outcomes, if you will, that were defined by those relationships if you did something wrong within the society, something that was typically judged to be wrong. What would happen to you, what the consequences were if you did something amiss in society, were to some degree determined by who you were, what your place was in society, but also, equally importantly, who it was that you had formal relationships with. Who were you, what group were you part of? And I'll talk more about what that means specifically in just a second here. But I said in passing just now that part of what determined consequences for actions was who you were within the society. And that leads into another central feature of traditional Celtic society, something that, again, is a little alien to contemporary North American sensibilities. And that is a really well-defined and central place in the society for the notion of personal honor. Now, honor is an English language word. It's not the word that would have been used in Irish or Welsh or any of the other Celtic languages. And it's a word that, like sacrifice, a word I talked about in the first lecture, has kind of gotten moved around a little bit in terms of what it connotes in contemporary life. And when we use honor these days, it's not identical to what it might really have implied in ancient Celtic society, but it's probably the closest word we have to represent what that concept would have been. Maybe a better word would be status. Maybe a better word would be worth. Maybe really a better word is value, in the sense of what your contribution to the society, the community in which you lived was. But there's also a sense involved with this of dignity, because what we're going to talk about in a second is the consequences for losing honor. If somebody deprives you of some measure of, some portion of this concept, your self-value, which is also the dignity that you carry in the society, that could be injured just as much as your body can be injured. So it is a complex concept that people tend to represent with the word honor, but I say that with the caveat that that's, again, sort of an oversimplification. What is interesting is that your personal honor, your value, your worthiness, the quantity of dignity that you had in the community could be valued. It could actually literally have a price attached to it, and did. And so if you were a king, you had one sort of concrete price tag attached to you. If you were a commoner, you had another. If you were a woman, you had another, and so on and so forth. The Irish word for this so-called honor price was enechlann, which is Enechllann. So everybody in the community had what is usually just sort of translated as an honor price. Now, recall from previous discussions that most of the Indo-European cultures, including the cultures of the Celts, can be thought of as having a roughly three-part, sort of three-layer cake structure. And then at the top you had people like the Druids and the kings. You had the holders of the sacred work, the religious functions, and also the legal and governmental functions, if you will. And then in the middle you had the so-called second function, which were the warriors. And then in the lowest or at least the third function, so-called, you have the producers, the people who supplied this community with all of its necessary goods and services. So it's a stratified society. It's a society that's not unlike, as I've said before, modern Hindu society in India where there are castes. And again, this honor price notion sort of corresponds to that. That people in certain castes within society, to use that word, even though it's not 100% accurate, people in certain castes would have more honor price attached to them. That if they were, say, killed, to use the extreme example, the cost that would be incurred by the person who killed them would be higher than, say, a serf or the second wife of a commoner. There could be, we have evidence for sort of multiple wives, or at least a main wife and concubines in at least certain periods in Irish history. Now that always strikes me as sort of odd. It's at odds with certainly American egalitarian values. We think all men are created equal, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's an important value system. It's something that operates in a kind of an interesting tension with some of these traditional Celtic values. But there is a common sense foundation to this system that I'm talking about. If you kill the king, you run the risk of inviting bloodshed, or at the very least chaos and disorganization. You throw the community into at least some kind of minor upheaval while a new king is selected and installed. And so there is more general damage to the community. And so to the extent that it might make one think more, have more pause before acting in killing a king, having a higher honor price attached to the king than to one of any number of commoners in the same community makes a certain kind of sense, even though it feels a little at odds with our latter-day values. The Celtic law codes, the traditional Celtic law codes, in a nutshell, were based primarily on restitution rather than retribution. They were based on forfeitures of property, things of value, rather than on punishment. And there's a few interesting things that flow out of that notion. First of those is that this stands to reason to some degree because this was a non-urban society with traditional folk customs governing the way people interacted as much as anything else. And there was not, to get to the point, a government running things that could in fact enforce punishment, that could deprive someone of liberty, put them in jail, hang them, what have you. For most of the history, and certainly in the pre-Christian era, all of the history of the Celtic peoples, there was not such a thing as a central government, or even really a municipal government. People like the Druids, with their knowledge of traditional custom, the way things have been done, were actually the closest thing to a government. And what they were relying on was tradition rather than a code of laws that was enacted by municipal government or a regional legislature, the sorts of institutions that we're used to, that we're accustomed to in America today. So again, there wasn't a government that could, say, build a jail to throw someone in when they committed a crime. So this makes sense. It's also worth looking at the English law codes, the English common law that we've inherited in North America, and setting that up next to the traditional Celtic law codes. The English law codes, common law that we operate under, does in fact enshrine retribution, essentially taking revenge for the crime. Society as a whole punishing the offender and not necessarily doing anything to restore in any meaningful way whatever imbalance or loss the crime inflicted on the community or any individual within the community. The Celtic law codes appear to be much more concerned with restoring balance to some degree. That if one individual or group of individuals in the community suffered a loss of their worth, of their worthiness, their capability, right, their value to the community, you might not be able to restore that. You try, right? And we'll come back to that in a second. But you might not be able to restore it. But at the very least, you can, in some sense, then take down the dignity, the value of the offender a notch, so that there is at least some kind of symbolic balance instituted, if nothing else. Now, in reality, it might be that you can pay the person who suffered, or the group of people who suffered the injury, in such a way that it did restore some of their economic loss. This system of laws is most closely related, among the institutions we're familiar with, to our civil law rather than our criminal law. It's a little bit more like going to court, filing suit against somebody, and seeking damages, and if you prove your case, being awarded monetary damages. That's, in a nutshell, how this worked. Only often, in olden days, the unit of payment was not cash, but cows. And a certain number of head of cattle would be stipulated by the precedents that the Druids or others among the Druid classes carried around with them and understood to be the traditional and just compensation for a particular injury. The word that describes the unit of recompense is cummal, C-U-M-A-L, and refers to a certain number of cattle. Once upon a time, originally, that word referred to a female concubine. So for those sort of romantic-minded people who want to idealize the pre-Christian Celts as a kind of idyllic society where men and women were equals, because we have evidence that there were women who served in the role of king at various times, et cetera, et cetera. The reality was that although women were treated better in traditional Celtic society than in many contemporary pagan societies in Europe, they were still secondary in most respects to men. And I think that the fact that the cummal, the female concubine, was a unit of payment initially is a pretty good example of that. That women back then could be treated as property just as much as they have in many other very patriarchal societies down through the ages since then. Women did have rights. As long as I'm on this subject, I should sort of follow it through to its conclusion. Women did have rights that other women elsewhere in Europe at the time did not have. In the case of a marriage, there were several different bride prices. There were different payments, you can call them dowries if you want, different transactions, different gifts that were exchanged on the occasion of a marriage. Some of them went from the bride's family to the husband's family, or the husband, but they also went the other way. There were mechanisms in place by these exchanges of property and gifts that were meant to ensure that the woman would be taken care of. That the woman, if the marriage could dissolve and divorce was a possibility, it was not forbidden, that they had property of their own that arose out of the marriage. And not just on the occasion of the marriage. There was a transfer of property, if I remember the way the law code's written correctly, there's a transfer of property that took place each year for a certain number of years of the marriage. At a certain point, that stopped, and it presumably was understood that at that point the marriage was stable. It wasn't going to dissolve. But in that sense, women, and other senses, women were treated better, with more dignity and more personal worth than in other contemporary cultures. Um, and women had their own honor price. They were not seen as just property, or subhuman. They were seen as real people with real value, with real worth, and they had legal protections. Forfeitures, if an injury was judged to have been incurred, were, as I've indicated, based on one's honor price and on some traditional understanding of how much the honor of the injured party had been affected. There's a word in Irish for the forfeiture that was made. That's dira, D-I-R-E. Another phrase is corp dira, C-O-R-P-D-I-R-E again. There's a specific word that refers to recompense for a bodily injury, including murder, which is the Airic, A-R-A-I-C. The punishment, forfeiture I really should say, would be determined by someone who traditionally has been called a brehon. In English, that's been spelled B-R-E-H-O-N. In Irish, the word is brehev, B-R-E-I-T-H-E-I-M-H. That role in Celtic society can be found referred to as far back as Julius Caesar, at least. There's a reference to a vergobret, V-E-R-G-O, B-R-E-T. There's that root word again in Caesar's account of his exploits in Gaul. So this is an old institution. And the brehon, this traditional Celtic jurist, is seen as related to the poets. And if we look at, and I'll talk more about this next week, if we look at what the poets were expected to study, one of the things that shows up is essentially legal precedent. And traditionally, it's understood that these legal precedents were formed in verse. And the same sort of oral transmission and memorization of these precedents was expected, as with the acquisition of verses. So this figure, the brehon, or brehev, is definitely part of the Druidic class. They're related to the poets, both the bards who would have performed eulogies and praise poetry, and the so-called Fili, who were the vision poets who presumably crafted sacred verse according to traditional meters and other conventions. This institution, as I say, goes back a long ways. There's a legal language, which in Old Irish was the Bear La Féini, which was already an archaic form of the Irish language by the 5th century. In other words, around the time of the relatively mass conversion to Christianity. The legal language, which was being preserved, in which these precedents were learned, was already an archaic language. It had been around long enough that by the 5th century it was already an archaic form. It isn't until around the 8th century, and tradition says the year 714, that these laws were regularized, that there was a legislature of some sort first convened, and that the law codes were to some degree standardized. And we don't have any manuscripts that record them that date back any further than the 11th century. The oldest version of any of these law codes in writing is in a manuscript called the Book of the Dun Cow, and that dates to the 11th century. So the evidence we have for these so-called brehon laws go back into pre-literate times. They weren't set down until many centuries after they were already in operation, and people were learning them and applying them in practical everyday life. Tradition, for what it's worth, assigns the brehon laws and their their first codification to the legendary King Lear in the mid-5th century. But as I say, based on how archaic the language is, we know that they date back further than that. The Brehon was somewhat like what we might think of as an arbitrator in contemporary American legal practice, that rather than going into court and having your civil case tried in front of a judge and or jury, you might agree to arbitration. And that image, you think of sort of two parties going into a room and sitting down as equals at a table with an arbitrator or a mediator. That's probably not a bad image to have of how this would have worked. One brought one's case before a Brehon. Both parties customarily would then be present, and the Brehon would at some point render a decision. Now, I've said there's no government to enforce the law, so why wouldn't the offending party just ignore the verdict of the Brehon? And that's where the importance of these kin groups, like the Gerb Finna, comes in, because everybody was, as I said earlier, interconnected, and you were responsible as a member of this kin group if another member of that group committed an injury and didn't pay the appropriate forfeiture. You were responsible. You and the other members of the kin group were responsible. So there was, in fact, a very powerful and very ancient system in place that helped to guarantee that balance would be restored if somebody committed an injury against another person in the society.
Meaning that the kin group had to pay?
Yes, absolutely. Or, there are different mechanisms, actually, several different mechanisms. Now, what if you felt you were offended against and the offender wouldn't acknowledge it? There's a traditional way in which one made one's grievance known to the community, and that was to fast against the offender. The image that's presented is of the person who's been offended against going and initiating a fast, a hunger strike, if you will, essentially on the doorstep of the offender. And whether or not the offending party came out and joined in the fast or not, signaled whether they were admitting guilt or not. One ideally would assume that when the fast was initiated against you, you would come forth and you would go with the complainant to the Brehon. But there could be a kind of a negotiating process that took place if you came out and joined in the fast as the supposed offending party. That very ancient custom has tremendous resonance in Irish culture. And in the 70s, in the prisons of Northern Ireland, when IRA prisoners undertook their very famous hunger strikes, they were explicitly, consciously hearkening back to that tradition, that they were proclaiming to the larger community that an injustice had been committed against them, and that people in Ireland who had not lost entirely their connection to the traditional Gaelic culture would understand that. And that essentially was the sort of complex message that was being sent, that those who had not lost their roots would understand that this was a cry out that an injustice had been performed against these prisoners, these political prisoners. Caesar mentions banishment from the sacrifices, that this sort of shunning always harkens to me to the Amish convention of shunning people from the community, that this sort of banishment or shunning was the worst punishment that could be inflicted. And that feels a little at odds with this admittedly oversimplified description of the Brehon laws, the traditional law code that I've just given. It's clearly a punishment that doesn't involve restitution. And in fact, it did take place. We have a word in Irish, dibart, D-I-B-A-R-T, that is banishment. Um, Now, obviously, there has to be some sort of mechanism to banish people from the community. And one assumes that that mechanism is the same as the mechanism that would ensure that restitution was made, payment was made, that others were responsible for seeing that the person left the community and didn't return. And that would be those people with whom the person was connected and who were participants in sustaining them in the community. If they withdraw their support and their sustenance, then the person has no choice but to leave, one assumes. I've been focusing on Ireland, and if the Irish so-called Brehon laws were the only example of a law code that came down to us from the Middle Ages or earlier, then I really should be talking about traditional law in Ireland rather than traditional law in the Celtic lands. But we do have at least one other significant example of a traditional law code that did survive and that we can look at, and it does have significant features that are parallel to the Irish laws. And that's the so-called law of Howell Law from Wales. And Howell Law was a ruler of Wales. His name is Hywel. Second word is DDA. Lovely Welsh word that seems to have far too many consonants, as so many of them do. This law code dates from the mid-10th century. That's when at least tradition says it would have originated. It's not set down in writing until at least the 13th century. So recall, if the earliest manuscript of the Irish laws is from the 10th century, the 11th century, then we're talking about at least a couple hundred years later. So we're further removed in this Welsh example from the pre-Christian, very ancient predecessors to this late medieval law code that we have in Wales. The notion is that Howell Law convened an assembly from the various subsidiary principalities that comprise Wales. There are a number of sort of petty kingdoms within Wales, and they've been relatively stable over the years. The conclave of representatives from these principalities was convened, and a standardized law code was hammered out. This law code is quite similar to the Irish laws. It has both implied and explicit similarities. And the most important of those similarities is that it, again, is based on a system of forfeiture and a recognition of shared accountability among, let's call them, clan members. It's not identical, and one wouldn't expect it to be because it dates from much later, as I've said, and it also, being Welsh, arises in a Celtic nation that had been much more influenced by a non-Celtic neighbor, in this case England. By the 13th century, Wales was already under tremendous pressure from England. Indeed, it's in that century that they come very much under English domination. By the end of that century, castles were being built, fortifications were being built by the English that were all part of the process of subjugating the Welsh. So when we look at this, it feels more like a contemporary law, sort of set of laws. It has less of a feeling of the kind of ancient, if not archaic, set of laws that survive in Ireland. It's less extensive, and it certainly shows more influence of continental and English law. But it still is important primarily because the main mechanisms are the same as in the Irish law. And that leads us to believe, and I think rightly, that the Celtic-speaking peoples as a whole along with having this institution of Druidism, had as part of that institution a mechanism for oral transmission of precedents, legal precedents over many generations, and the use of people who were schooled like the bards, like the Fili, like the Druids, as the professionals within the society who enforced those laws, who upheld the order of the society. Just a couple last thoughts about that society and structure and architecture, just to kind of hark back to some things I said earlier. I've said tonight and previously that this is a sort of stratified culture that we're looking at. And tonight we've seen that one's worth in the society could be determined by where one sort of stood in that pecking order, if you will. There are other examples of this kind of stratification. Within individual professions, there were grades through which one could progress. And the really relevant one here is in the bardic training, the training of the poets. There were a number of grades that you progressed to as you learned certain number of verses, as you showed your proficiency in composing and performing verses. You could progress through a number of stages that would culminate in you becoming a so-called Olaf, which is O-L-L-A-M-H in Irish, or you'll see it in English as O-L-L-A-V-E. And that, in contemporary Irish, is still the word for a professor. And it implied that you had mastered, sort of like getting your PhD, that you had progressed through all of the training and then reached the top grade. And so your value could be related to that as well. But status played out, this sort of notion of personal honor played out in all sorts of different ways in the society. And I just want to sort of close with a couple sort of not necessarily completely related, but I think interesting examples. The first is in the feast, in the community feast. We have the custom of the so-called heroes portion, that when it came time to divide up the meal, whatever animal had been, presumably a cow, when it came time to divide up portions, the choicest portion went to the person who had showed themselves worthiest in whatever exploit, presumably a battle the men had just gone through. And so there was a custom that that person got the choicest and the first portion. So there was, again, a kind of a hierarchy, but it was a hierarchy based on proven worth, not on how you were born or where you lived. It was based on merit. And so, just to take that and flip it slightly, the kingship, the institution of kingship, or chieftainship to be really more precise, among the Irish and the Scots and other Celtic peoples, was not based on parentage. It wasn't based on bloodline. It was ultimately based on merit. And there were elections. Now, these institutions would change. They'd evolve from century to century, and they're different from place to place. This isn't one sort of monolithic culture that existed without changing down through the centuries. But as often as not, who was ruling was determined by election. It was determined by merit. There might be a designated successor to the chieftain, and that person would have to show themselves worthy. In medieval Scotland, we find that the kings were chosen by the nobles. So it's not the kind of hereditary system that we're sort of accustomed to thinking of from the English examples that we're most familiar with from our English language culture, but something that, while you could find yourself locked into a certain value in your community based on what you did, the society as a whole paid tremendous attention to merit. And so what one did and what one was capable of was never ignored, was never set aside in favor of who you were related to or where or when or from whom you were born. And with that, I'm going to conclude.